To talk more about all of this, we are joined by the perfect guest, Ari Berman, friend of the show, who literally wrote the book on voter suppression, Give Us the Ballot, The Modern Struggle for Voting Rights in America. Ari is also a senior reporter for Mother Jones magazine. He's been highlighting the issue of voting rights since well before it became fashionable or popular or had presidents giving speeches about it. Ari, thank you so much for being on the show tonight. First off, what did you make of the speech? Did it do what it had to do? Was it enough for you?
Hey, Mehdi, I think that it got it half right, meaning that I think Joe Biden got the rhetorical piece of it right. He accurately described this as Jim Crow in the 21st century. He talked about the threat being between democracy and autocracy. He talked not only about all the laws that make it more difficult to vote, but all the laws that actually subvert election results, which is perhaps the most chilling part of all of this. So I thought Biden's rhetoric was very sharp. The problem was, what are you going to do about all of it? He talked about it being a national imperative to pass the For the People Act and to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, but he didn't lay out how the Senate should pass it. What should senators do if these bills don't attract 60 votes, which everyone knows they're not going to? So what is your path forward to changing the Senate rules to pass these bills? And he didn't give any details on any of that. And so the question is there going to be another speech about how to pass these bills, or is this the end of the campaign?
It's a very good point. It was a 25-minute speech, and the F word didn't make an appearance throughout. The filibuster was not mentioned. So when he says stuff like, we must pass this bill, we will do this, we will... How? I mean, as you say, the guy is a former senator. The President of the United States spent decades in the Senate. He knows very well that the filibuster is the block to all of this. A moment ago, I was just speaking with a Texas state representative who made exactly that point, that she wants to meet with Joe Manchin, convince him that he has to come on board. This idea that Joe Biden can give a speech on voting rights, which is bigged up as a big speech, as him taking the fight to the Republicans, and not mention the filibuster, I just think... it's almost cynical, because everyone in the White House who helped him write that speech knows full well that the filibuster is the be-all, end-all of the For the People Act.
Yeah, you're not taking the fight to Republicans unless you're actually passing congressional legislation to roll back voter suppression.
Yes.
And until they pass that congressional legislation to roll back voter suppression, Republicans are just going to keep steamrolling democracy, because the only thing the Republicans are afraid of right now is the possibility of federal legislation blocking their efforts. They're not afraid of the courts because they control the courts. They're not afraid of states because they control the states. The only lever of power they don't control right now is the federal government, and there's really been no response from the federal government. And so there's this disconnect between the White House's rhetoric, which is talking about this existential threat to democracy, and the reality that they really haven't done anything to combat this. The Justice Department filed one major lawsuit against Georgia, which is going to be very difficult to win now that the Supreme Court has further gutted the Voting Rights Act. Biden issued an executive order on voting, but that really just tinkers around the margins. There has not been a 1965-like Voting Rights Act response to this new wave of voter suppression efforts. So if you believe this threatens the soul of democracy, if you believe this is Jim Crow in the 21st century, then you absolutely should be doing everything you can to try to stop it. And maybe it's true that even if Biden leaned on Joe Manchin, leaned on Kyrsten Sinema, they wouldn't change their mind. But it's not clear he actually has leaned on them. It's not actually clear they have created a full court press to pass this. It's not clear they've done anything on voting relative to as much as they've done on infrastructure. So I think there's a lot more the White House could do. Would it succeed ultimately? We don't know, but they have to try first.
So Ezra Levin of Indivisible, who's been on this show a few times, I quoted him on Sunday to Jen Psaki, the White House press secretary, who was a top guest on my show on Sunday night on MSNBC. He said, well, Joe Biden's been MIA, missing in action. Now you have this big speech where he's back, he's center stage, he's dominating the headlines today. He's not mentioning the filibuster. You have Jen Psaki saying to me on Sunday and saying to the White House press corps yesterday that, well, it's not up to the president to change the filibuster, that's up to the Senate, so the president doesn't have a role in this. That's just not true, is it? The president can, as you say, lean on Manchin, lean on Sinema, push Schumer in a certain direction. He could give a speech today where he said, the Senate, Democrats in the Senate, you must all get rid of the filibuster or reform the filibuster tomorrow. The president has power. It's a bully pulpit. But he just didn't use it today.
Not only does he have power, he understands the Senate rules better than anyone. He's uniquely placed to have a Nixon goes to China moment on the filibuster, because he can say to Joe Manchin, hey, I understand the Senate rules just as well as you do. I understand the need for bipartisanship just as well as you do. But there's some things that we can't compromise on. And when Republicans are unilaterally making it harder to vote in the states, we can't then say we need 10 Republicans to get on board with us, because it's never going to happen. This isn't like trying to build more roads and bridges. This is an issue where the Republicans have radicalized against democracy. And so you can't count on them to try to save American democracy. So our legacy has to be using the power we have to try to solve this problem. And I don't think he has delivered this message. When the White House says that Joe Biden has not changed his position on the filibuster, then why would Joe Manchin change his position on the filibuster?
Exactly.
So until Biden says the filibuster has to change, we need to exempt voting rights legislation from the filibuster. Until he delivers that message, he's not actually leaning on Joe Manchin or any other Senate Democrats to use their power to change the Senate rules.
And you have Jim Clyburn, who was also a guest on the show last week, saying, make an exception. If you don't want to get rid of the filibuster for everything, just for voting rights legislation, carve out an exception on the filibuster. Because as Jasmine Crockett and I were just discussing, at a state level, Republicans are doing everything in a partisan way. Why on earth should it be bipartisan in D.C. when it comes to protecting democracy? Let me ask you this, Ari. Something that jumped out at me from the speech is when Joe Biden acknowledged today that the Supreme Court, quote, again weakened, he said, the Voting Rights Act with its recent voting rights decision in Brnovich versus the DNC, the Arizona voting restrictions, which the Supreme Court came out in favor of us, 6-3. He said that in the speech, and then he followed up by saying, that's why we need new federal legislation. I would argue the exact opposite. What that case tells us is that you can't protect voting rights simply with legislation. You have to fix the imbalanced, illegitimate Supreme Court. You have to expand and rebalance it. Otherwise, they will just strike down whatever Congress passes. And yet Joe Biden and other leading Democrats like Nancy Pelosi don't seem interested in Supreme Court reform. They're even less interested in Supreme Court reform than they are in filibuster reform.
Well, it's one of those one reform at a time type deals, because if we can't even get filibuster reform, which we've had on a number of other issues over the years, it's going to be very hard to get Supreme Court reform. I happen to believe that Congress does have the power to pass the For the People Act and make it constitutional, and I believe they have the power to write a new Voting Rights Act and make it constitutional. That's something that they can actually control. But it's very likely that this court is so radical, it would strike it down. And I do think that court reform has to be on the table. But right now, if you're prioritizing reforms, I think filibuster reform is something that is more of an imminent threat, and also something that's more doable compared to court reform, which I absolutely agree with you needs to happen, but is more down the road. Listen, I would like to change the structure of the U.S. Senate. I would like to abolish the Electoral College. There's a lot of things I would like to do that aren't going to happen tomorrow. Yes. But I think getting Democrats to agree on a carve out to protect voting rights to the filibuster, I don't know if that's doable, but I think it's more doable than court reform or all of these other reforms that we need to see.
Yes, that's fair. Ari Berman, always a pleasure. Thank you for joining me on the show this evening. Hi, I'm Mehdi Hasan. Thanks for checking out our channel on YouTube. You can see more of the Mehdi Hasan Show by clicking on any of the videos on this screen, and make sure you subscribe below to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. Thank you for watching.